All right.
It's recording.
All right, perfect. So yeah, why don't we get into a little bit about standard landing zones, right? So if you're not familiar with that term, it's kind of what Microsoft calls, how you should start using the cloud and where you should start deploying your infrastructure to, right? So, when you're building out kind of your cloud strategy, there's a lot to think about, and Microsoft put together what they call the cloud adoption framework to help with that. Start coming up with a standardized way of organizing all of your resources, naming conventions, monitoring, managing costs, and, putting proper what we call guardrails in place when we're deploying our infrastructure. And then all of our different workloads go into these things here called landing zones, right? So you might have an application landing zone, you might have a production landing zone, you might have, it's kind of up to you how you want to group things. But today's talk is on, a specific type of landing zone called data landing zones. And really what that is a specialized set of tools for you to do, advanced data analytics, right? And when we talk about, data analytics in the cloud, really it's three main components: ingesting data, and as we ingest that data, how do we govern and manage access to that data? And then there's kind of data cleaning and data processing, and then at the other end there's data consumption, right? So what they call the cloud analytics scenario, or the cloud scale analytics scenario, this is really an extension on top of the standardized, Azure landing zone. So it's going to make use of those components that you've already deployed, and it's going to introduce some new components, right? So one of the things we'll be talking about is this data management landing zone. And then finally over here, we have a data landing zone, and you're going to have one or more of these, based on the size of your organization. And really the idea here is to build data products, right? And a data product is providing value to your business. Okay, so this might be consuming some data from a database and then processing it and producing some reports. It might be integrating with a bunch of third-party, data APIs, and again, aggregating that data and doing something, and then, viewing it on a dashboard or exposing it as an API. So, instead of them being kind of user-focused applications, these are applications that typically run in the background, go out, ingest data, clean that data, process it, and then present it to users to, look at and do further analysis. So in order to do all of this, there's a special set of tools on top of kind of our standard, landing zone that we have to deploy in a consistent way. So another way of kind of looking at it is like this: if you have your standard enterprise or, basic Azure landing zone, we're going to be deploying these additional capabilities, right? The management landing zone, and then one or more data landing zone. And then inside the data landing zone, this is kind of the unit of work, if you will. This is the thing that we're going to be scaling out. So not going to say that each one of your data teams has their own, one data team could be responsible for building many of these data applications, but this is like that unit of work inside the data landing zone. So this is kind of what we want to standardize and be able to deploy in a repeatable fashion. And when we do that, we get best practices around, how do these things talk in terms of networking, down to like even private DNS and NSGs. How do we do RBAC and Azure AD groups, right? So that when we're onboarding users to, start creating these and using them, it's done in a standard way. And then how do we configure all the various tools like Azure Data Factory, Azure Databricks, Azure Synapse, all the things in the data landscape? How do we configure those to provide proper isolation for all of these data applications? So yeah, that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, is how do we build this stuff out using infrastructure as code. So just diving a little bit deeper around the data management landing zone, this is a thing to a lot of people. But as we start onboarding lots of data into Azure, we need a way to understand what that data is. Maybe it's sensitive. Maybe, you need to protect who has access to it. Maybe you don't even understand what the schema looks like. So Azure Purview is a tool that Microsoft launched, I don't know, probably a couple of years ago. It's not the only data governance tool. There's a few other ones, but Azure Purview's job is to basically scan and look at all the data that you are ingesting into your landing zone. And it does automatic classification and then provides tools for, aggregating and collating that data, and then offering it out to people that might be interested in it. So a lot of things, a lot of times when, clients are talking to us about data projects, the first question they ask is, we don't even know what data we have. We don't know what data is available. And this kind of builds out that, data catalog so that you can start seeing all your data. So, and again, you have to do this in a standard way so that as you're onboarding these tools, they're all pre-configured to work with Azure Purview. The other things that we do in the data management landing zone is focused on monitoring. So this is going to be the central place for all of these components to send their logs to, as well as, doing policy and Defender and things like that. So this is the central place for doing that. And then if we break down kind of the data landing zone, this is where we're deploying kind of the core services, right? So I've mentioned these before. This is Data Factory. This is used for ingesting data, and it's got connectors to a whole bunch of different, data sources. So from SQL databases to Oracle to, being able to talk to SAP. In fact, I think it's got over 100 different connectors now. Azure Data Lake Storage becomes kind of the fundamental storage system, right? And we deploy a few different data lakes within a data landing zone so that we can kind of aggregate our data or isolate our data into kind of tiers of quality. So it starts kind of with bronze data. And when we talk about ingesting, what we're really doing is taking raw data and getting it into our bronze data lake. And then we're going to use tools like Databricks or Synapse, which are Spark-based tools, to kind of clean that data and move it from bronze into kind of a silver state. And then finally, the gold state, that's kind of on the far right, that's our highest quality data. That would be aggregating various silver data sets together and producing what's called a reporting data set, or a gold data set that you might offer up through an API. So yeah, when we talk about deploying a data landing zone, what we're talking about is deploying all of the infrastructure and tools, up into Azure, hardening those tools, and then configuring them so that we can onboard data applications. And that's kind of the last thing. At a high level, a data application is that unit of work or that unit of scale inside a data landing zone. It's typically composed of one or more data integrations, right? And it exposes one or more data products. And data products is a fancy term for data that you've aggregated and are now exposing to business. And it typically provides some kind of value to the business. Maybe it's a sales dashboard, or the number of items that are being sold per hour, something like that. It's providing a KPI or an aggregate of KPIs to business. Okay, so luckily we didn't have to start from scratch, because that's a lot of stuff to think about and deploy. So Microsoft did come up with some reference design around deploying data landing zones. So this is all on GitHub. And if we go to the next slide, they've even built out, individual repos around, the different things that I was just going through. So as you can see here, this is their kind of core data management landing zone. And then we have this data landing zone here. And then these are the individual data products or data applications. And they have templates, for different ones. Some might be focused on batch data, which this one is. Others are on more streaming data. So this will deploy, in addition to the things that I showed you, things like Event Hub and streaming analytics, right? And then this one here is more focused on doing some modeling, right? So tools that data scientists might use. So again, there's a good starting point. But what we found was it really is just a starting point. When you really get into, deploying these out for a bunch of clients, it just kind of scratches the surface about doing the deployment, but it doesn't do a lot of stuff that we found we were doing manually as we were onboarding more and more products. So what we kind of did was we took these reference designs and came up with our own, kind of toolkit, and that's what we're going to be walking through today. Toolkit makes our life easy. We have to support many clients and many data landing zones. So what we've done is kind of standardized our approach to doing those deployments. And we use a series of parameters so that we can configure our toolkit to work, and deploy out different scenarios. Any questions so far? Good to go? Okay, so what I'm going to do is do a quick intro to Bicep, and we're kind of, build from there. I'll switch back into slides just to show you some stuff visually in terms of what's actually being deployed, but I'll try and spend a bit more time in VS Code so you can see what this stuff looks like. Why Bicep? I guess let's start there. Why didn't we use Terraform? Good question. No reason why you can't do what we've done in a tool like Terraform. But at the time that we were adopting and building this toolkit, the reference designs that I was showing you over here, they were all done using Bicep. So I think the Terraform ones are coming. They may even be out in preview, but they were not, fully baked when we wanted to start working on this stuff. So we kind of bit the bullet and learned Bicep. For those that don't know Bicep, it's a kind of you can think of it as a language that sits on top of ARM. ARM's a little bit of a pain in the butt to use, right? Very big JSON files, especially if you're hand coding them. So Bicep is a nicer language to work with. And at the end of the day, what it does is it compiles down into ARM so that you can do your deployments using, probably the familiar Azure Resource Manager model to do your deploys out. So let's hop over into VS Code. And let me just take you through kind of a simple Bicep file. So we're looking at a Bicep file that's used to deploy an Azure Key Vault. And there's a couple of things to note. There's a scope. So this is kind of, well, where are you deploying this component to? Your scope can be a resource group, or it can be a subscription, or it can even be a management group or a tenant, right? Depending on what you're deploying. If you're deploying a subscription, then you'd be, targeting a management group, and so on and so forth. But yeah, for a key vault, we typically deploy our key vaults into a resource group. We have a series of parameters, right? This helps us kind of make our, what we're looking at here, this is called a module. It helps make our module configurable and reusable, right? You can do things like providing a little bit of validation to your parameters, okay? So if we look at this parameter here, it needs to take on one of these two values, right? So this controls, it's very useful if you're deploying out virtual machines and you want to kind of limit what SKUs or things like that. You can kind of create a controlled list of parameters. Parameters do not need to have values, right? So we have kind of required parameters up here. You see they don't have a default value.
Good question, Dave.
Yep.
How do you make a required parameter?
Yeah, so just don't give it a default value.
Okay, so every parameter is required?
Yeah, that means these 5 up here are required.
Okay, but like if you want an optional parameter, how do you do that then?
You just give it a value.
Oh, that's weird, but okay.
Yeah, you don't have to flag it as required or non-required. As long as you give it a default value, it becomes optional. There might be another way to do it. I don't know if there's an at required here. I haven't looked at that. By the way, the new tooling in VS Code, what I'm showing here it's quite good. It wasn't great when it first came out, but I think we're getting close to the official launch of Bicep. So the tooling is been much improved over the past few months.
If you were doing multi-cloud, would you have to? Could you use Bicep, or would you have to use Terraform?
So that's the one thing. Bicep is 100% aligned with the Azure. It's only for Azure.
Right. Okay.
So again, Terraform, multi-cloud, Bicep, specific to Azure. Some things I find are easier in Bicep versus Terraform. It's all, you know, at the end of the day, they can both accomplish the same things, but because Bicep is designed specifically for Azure, you know, when we start looking at, say, something like a key vault, all of the different parameters and all of the IntelliSense that we get is very specific for, you know, a key vault. And this is a 100% aligned with the REST API for this particular resource, right? So you can even see here, I think we get in the IntelliSense, right? We can choose what version of the ARM API that we're targeting with this particular deployment, right? And then the IntelliSense will change accordingly. So it's pretty cool. I've found that it's fairly up to date with, right? So Bicep doesn't need to kind of lag behind. Like there's nothing special that needs to be done. As soon as a new version of that ARM API is available, we can target it and use it through Bicep. Whereas Terraform, what I found is there's a little bit of a gap in between because they have to update their Terraform provider, you know, to support those new features. So yeah, this is a key vault, right? If we break this thing down, everything's got a name, right? A location where we're deploying it to, some tags, and then, you know, a specific set of properties, which you can parameterize any of these things if you want, and then just pull them down, right? Like for example, this one here, this is being set by a parameter from above. So a good one, not sure why we haven't done it yet, probably here. To be able to switch between standard and premium key vault, you'd want to make that a parameter. The other thing that we do when we set up a module like this is we built in access control. So we think through, well, what RBAC needs to be assigned into this component, and we can build that in. And then we can look at, you know, deploying at the same time as the key vault corresponding, you know, private endpoint, and then setting up the DNS for that private endpoint. And then kind of the final thing that we do for every component is think through what are the proper diagnostic settings that should be set up. And, you know, as I was showing you guys earlier, you typically want to route, you know, most of your logs to the data management landing zone, which is kind of the default, you know, how we set this stuff up. So yeah, that's a kind of a brief intro to Bicep. There's a lot more to it, but Bicep is kind of the underlying foundation for building out, you know, the entire, what I'm going to walk you through kind of moving forward. Actually, I guess there's another foundational component, which is PowerShell. So we stitched everything together using PowerShell. And PowerShell core in specific. So what I'm showing you running here is actually running in, you know, WSL. So it can run in Linux, can run in Windows. But yeah, because it's PowerShell core, it doesn't really matter. I just found that it was a little bit more performant for me to be doing things in WSL, or that, for those that don't know that, that's the Windows subsystem for Linux. So Okay, so let's just flip back to PowerPoint for 1 sec. Oh, that's my Visio. Where's PowerPoint? Okay, so when we look at the toolkit, and I'll walk through this, there's kind of different main zones that are deployed. There's this connectivity zone, and that's providing kind of the main connections and connectivity inside your landing zone. This is not specific to a data landing zone. This is the same connectivity zone that you would be deploying, you know, using the enterprise model of the cloud adoption framework. But this is kind of a key thing, right? This sets up like our main firewall. This provides ways for us to get into, you know, our private networks, whether it's going to be through a VPN, or maybe you're going to use Bastion, which lets you, you know, get to jump boxes. This sets up all of our private DNS zones and private DNS zone forwarding, right? And then it provides a couple of core services that let us access things like Synapse and Data Factory and now Databricks completely using private endpoints, so that, you know, we don't have to access our tools over the public internet. So really the goal of the connectivity zone is to provide a real lockdown experience, so that everything else on the right side has zero public connectivity, right? Everything, all network traffic is then, you know, all going through the firewall, and you have to access everything, you know, using the VPN. So not going to focus a lot on the connectivity zone. I'm going to focus, you know, most of my attention on, you know, the data landing zone and the different data apps. So just a couple of things around this toolkit. We had some goals when we set out to build this, right? So first goal, we wanted to make sure that everything that we were building could run 100% like locally, you know, on developers' machines, instead of having to push code up to either Azure DevOps or GitHub to run. So that was one of the decision points, to kind of minimize what's done in YAML and pipelines, and, you know, make use of local scripting, you know, and doing a lot of stuff in PowerShell. But at the end of the day, we also wanted to fully support Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions, right? So because we're not making heavy use of these things and the bulk of the work is done through scripting, doesn't really matter which one you target, because at the end of the day, you're really just having this thing execute scripts. Another goal, like we said, had to remain cross-platform. Talked about using, you know, a minimal amount of special tasks in DevOps and GitHub. And then the other concept here is that we wanted to treat the infrastructure as being disposable, right? So destroy and recreate at will was kind of the idea here, so that you can, you know, constantly tweak, get it right, and then, you know, incrementally add after that, or tear it down and recreate it. And another kind of goal was consistent naming across, you know, everything, because like how the components are named, you know, how Azure AD groups are named, you know, where the environment prefix should go, all of that we standardized, and made it a bit configurable too, because each client kind of had their own convention. Mind you, they're generally the same. So, you know, trying to use consistent naming. Then the last thing we did is that if you start using a component, something like, say, a key vault or a storage account, or an NSG, if you start using that component in multiple zones, then move it into shared, right? And make it parameterized so that you can, you know, reuse it more easily. So that was another kind of thing too. So as we built this out, we started moving more things into this shared folder here, right? So just kind of a quick breakdown. You know, it's kind of set up the way you would think. This guy here is all focused on deploying the connectivity zone. This is our data management zone, and then we have our data landing zone here, okay? And then finally, yeah, shared, we just talked about that. Each one of these things has .azdo and a .github folder. This is where the artifacts specific to deploying this, zone through those tools would go. I haven't built out a lot in the GitHub one, but this is kind of the YAML file. And we'll kind of get through that. So each one of these zones here has a corresponding pipeline in Azure DevOps or GitHub, right? So while we can deploy and test things locally, ultimately we want to be able to, do proper PRs of our code and have proper versioning and automated pipelines to deploy the infrastructure that things deploy. So that actually might be a good segue for me to flip over into, let's go into Azure DevOps for a sec. Okay, so this is the Azure DevOps, one of our kind of test environments for building out this toolkit. And what you do see is almost a one-to-one relationship between those zones and these pipelines. So this con pipeline here is responsible for doing builds and validations and deployments of the connectivity zone. Then we have one for the data management landing zone, one for the data landing zone, and then one for the various data apps that get deployed. You may have multiple pipelines for each of the data apps, but you can also use one and then just have a whole bunch of stages, and each stage represents, a different data application. So in terms of connectivity back into Azure, it's using kind of standard service connections. Each one of these zones is deployed to its own subscription. So what we've done is we've set up service connections at the subscription level. And since, these zones do things like RBAC configuration, they do require like owner RBAC to the subscription. So, they're going to be creating resource groups, they're going to be creating Azure AD groups, and then they're going to be signing, those Azure AD groups to different RBAC within that subscription. So yeah, it is pretty heightened in terms of what access the service connection needs. But I mean, at the same time, these pipelines are used for deploying infra, so they kind of need that. Okay, yeah, I'll flip. One of the nice things about, having this all set up with pipelines is, having well-known version for each of these modules as we're deploying them, which allows you to start kind of understanding, what version of the infrastructure we're currently running on. And, allows you to kind of control when you want to upgrade those versions. So all of that, all the standard stuff that we typically do with CI/CD, we're now applying to our infrastructure. And then the traceability that this gives us it's huge, which I'm going to kind of show as we go through what a deployment looks like. Okay, so a little bit about, all of these modules. They're all kind of structured the same way. When we think about, well, what do we have to do? I'm going to actually flip into a data app here. We all kind of go through the same basic process when we're building one of these. There's a build and a validation of the template. And then when it comes to deploying it, the deployment consists of kind of 3 phases. There's kind of a pre-deployment, and that's stuff that needs to happen prior to the Bicep being deployed, right? Then we deploy the Bicep templates, and that creates a lot of the, infrastructure and resources. And then there's a post-deployment where we might do some configuration of those components that you can't do using Bicep, right? So an example of post-deployment is going in and configuring Databricks to, do certain things that, again, you just can't do using Bicep. And we might make use of things like other CLIs. So in that case, the Databricks CLI. So there's always kind of a 3-step process. There's a pre-deploy, a deploy, and then a post-deploy. And all of this, again, we wanted to be able to do using kind of local tooling. So I'm just going to show off, some of that tooling that's here. So when we look at a data app, or all of these modules, they all kind of have the same starting point, right? Yeah.
Hi, just want to on related topic. If you do give user, if you create a service connection that has the owner permissions on the subscription, make sure that the service connection is not by default allowed to be used by every pipeline.
Yeah, 100%. You have to lock all of that down. So if you're a pipeline and you try and use that service connection, it requires permission to, be granted access. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So some kind of controls, right? And the line 10 through 12 is redundant. It's there's a system variable called system debug.
Yeah.
That's a checkbox at the bottom.
Yeah, no, I know. I'll go through why we separated it. Yeah, but this is really the verbosity level on all of our scripts. But yes, we could have tied it directly into that checkbox. There was a few use cases where people wanted to see verbose logging in the scripts, but not all of the extra agent stuff. So we just came up with this. But you're right. In the early days, we just tied directly to system.debug.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to show what it looks like when we do a build, right? So when you build one of these modules or one of these zones, it does a few different things. Number one, it needs to load up a bunch of parameters, because these templates here, you end up getting, quite a few parameters, right, as we go through them. I showed you guys a very simple one, like with Key Vault, but if we look at, this data app, there are a lot of different parameters around, setting one of these things up. So what we wanted to do was come up with a way where, I didn't duplicate the parameters that Bicep was using. I wanted to be able to share those same parameters with my kind of deployment scripts, right? So we wrote a little tool and kind of standardized and said, hey, since we have to define all of these parameters for our Bicep, we might as make use of, these parameter files here. So this is the way that you can control all of these different parameters and deploy different instances of this data app. So for example, this one here is deploying our sample app, which is the New York City taxi trip data application. And this in particular one is for the dev environment. So if we had a QA environment, a prod environment, each one of those may have its own parameter file. And then every data app that you deploy would probably have its own parameter file, right? And these things kind of control what you are deploying for that data app, right? Do you need a key vault? Are you deploying Debezium? Debezium is a change data capture tool that's commonly used for data ingestion, right? Do you want an event hub in the main event hub account that's inside the data landing zone? And if yes, what are the different parameters around that event hub? So yeah, all of the different components that we have, like Synapse and Data Factory, they're all kind of controlled through a series of parameters here. And the first thing that we do when we do a build is we parse all of these parameters, and that means that they're now available. It doesn't really matter when you're building, but when we do a deploy and want to run like a pre-deploy and then a post-deploy, we can make use of all of these parameters. And then, yeah, to show you that switch, when you run in verbose mode, you just get a lot more output. Again, when you're doing a build, not a big deal. So this step here is building your Bicep, and what that's doing is converting your Bicep into JSON, right? Which is your standard ARM template. So this one Bicep file gets compiled into this kind of huge, I forget how many lines, many hundreds of lines of JSON. Right? Almost 2,000 lines, right? So yeah, that's the build. And this will find syntax errors, circular references and things like that. So it's kind of your first level. But then the second level is you can actually do a deployment, of this Bicep. But instead of actually doing a deploy, it runs in validation mode. So it kind of simulates the the deployment being done, and then it writes the results out into this artifacts folder. Okay, so we can actually see and take a look at what happened, during the build, and it goes through and spits out a bunch of information about what would have actually been deployed if it runs, and gives you a bunch of details that you can kind of look at. Again, we didn't build this. This is built into the Bicep system. We're just taking advantage of it. So yeah, that's kind of the building validation step. And when you look at the pipelines in Azure, that's the first stage of the Azure pipeline. They're all multi-stage pipelines. So we separated out the build and validation from the actual deploy, so that one, you could run it, as part of your pull request. So every time a pull request is created and updated, it runs that first stage. And then if everything looks good and you do your merge into main, then it runs the second stage. So the second stage is broken into, 3 parts, right? That's what I was saying. There's a pre-deploy, a deploy, and a post-deploy. So with our tool, that we've put in place, you don't have to run them all. You can just go in and say, hey, I'm going to do a pre-deploy and just test out that script. So we look at a pre-deployment. What is this doing here? This is basically creating some standardized Azure AD groups, and it's going in and making sure that these groups are set up with the proper memberships and roles, right? It also does, a couple of things. It detects if Azure Data Factory is already there, and if there's global parameters, for our Azure Data Factory. But you can do whatever you want basically in the pre-deployment, and this is the stuff that needs to happen prior to the Bicep deploy. And the reason we need to have these AD groups created ahead of time is we actually pass these into the deployment and set up a lot of RBAC and stuff during the Bicep deploy. So it saves us from having to, run this, copy the GUIDs for these things, and then manually set them into the parameter file, right? All of these different GUIDs here. We can just create them. If they already create, we read them, we get their GUIDs, and then we pass them into parameters that get used kind of downstream. So if we want to do a full deploy, we can use this switch, and this is going to rerun the pre-deploy. And it actually, let's go. And now it's going to actually run the Bicep deploy, which we can go into the Azure portal and start tracking. So I'm just going to give it a sec. Okay, so over in the portal, this is the subscription that it's deploying to, and we can go over to deployments. And, this is our little naming convention that we came up with. It's not being done through Azure DevOps, which, if it was through Azure DevOps, it uses that. This tells us that this particular one is a local deploy. And if you don't specify a build number by default, it uses 0.0.0. But when you're running locally, you can put whatever build number you want so that you can kind of track your particular release. Otherwise, this is the actual build number that came from Azure DevOps. So yeah, that's how you get that traceability. Then if we go into one of these deploys, we can see all of the different things that it's actually deploying, right? So it's creating this resource group. It's not deploying a new Event Hub namespace, sorry, but it is deploying an Event Hub specific to this data app inside that Event Hub subscription. It does some RBAC. It sets up a specific key vault for secrets, just again for this. This is the change data capture that I was talking about. It does spin up a data factory instance, and then it links this data factory to kind of the core data factory in the landing zone, because that's the one that manages all of the data factory runtimes. So instead of having to create a bunch of different data, runtimes over here, we can share kind of the common ones and reuse the compute. So, yeah, so this is what happens during a deployment. And then during post-deploy, what happens is that it goes in and it does more fine-grained configuration of these different components. So we'll take a quick look at that, and then I'll hop over and show you what was actually deployed. Really, the idea behind a lot of this is that we wanted to, come up with a standard approach, and our clients wanted a standard approach for onboarding new data applications quickly. So how do we set up all of the folders in, those data lake storage? How do we do the access control on those folders so that only the right people can read and write, the data going to and from those folders? How do we create clusters in Databricks so that, again, they remain in isolation just for this particular data app so that they don't collide with, other Databricks clusters? And then again, how do you do all the permissions around it? So all of that stuff is happening in the PostScript, and I'll kind of walk through, this is kind of the secret sauce that you don't get with the reference implementation. So Databricks requires a service principal. So this first part of the post deployment is to create a service principal that's going to be used by the clusters that get created kind of further down. So this is just a standard app registration with a service principal, and then it gets added into one or more of these Azure AD groups, right? Depending on what's required. So the data factory one is specific for doing data integration work. So, its job is for reading external storage and bronze storage and writing to bronze storage, right? So it gets added into this group. And then kind of the data product, it's responsible for reading bronze and creating and writing to silver and gold, right? So it has different permissions. And then finally, the data consumer group that gets set up, it is for reporting read-only access to the data, right? So again, we've come up with this kind of standard set for every data application. The operator is kind of your admin level. And this service principal that's created down here gets added into, I think, the data integration and data product group, and then the data factory service principal is just added to the data integration group. So that's the first part, creating and assigning some service principals. Then all of those Azure AD groups that you saw above, we actually create those within Databricks, because Databricks is kind of its own entity, if you will. It has its own, they don't call it RBAC, they call it access control. There is no direct link between Azure AD groups and Databricks groups. There's some tools that help us keep those things synchronized, but the actual creation of the groups, you need to do through a script. So what we do is we take those groups and create those in Databricks so that we can assign the same kind of permissions. And when we onboard a user into that group in AD, we can make sure that they also get onboarded into this group in Databricks. Now, there is a tool called a skim that you can use that does some of that synchronization if you have Azure AD Premium and you're running Databricks Premium, but you can also do some of it using some pretty simple scripts, which we've set up and done. Then the next thing that this thing does is a secret scope, right? So everything needs secrets. In Azure, those secrets are stored in Key Vault, right? So what this does is it goes into Databricks and it sets up secret scopes. If they already exist, it then does access control, right? So using these groups that's created here, who should be able to read secrets and who has the ability to manage and write secrets. And this is through, if you're writing, any code in Databricks or, notebooks as well. Linking Databricks into a Git repo, and again, the permissions on who has access into that Git repo. So this does not create the actual Git repo, it's just hooking it into Databricks, and then providing access into it. Then the big thing is setting up clusters and doing all the permissions on those clusters so that they can do their work. Then finally, configuration of all the data lake storage, right, which we talked about before. So who should be able to read, write bronze, read, write silver and gold, and then, you know, who has access into what they call workspace storage. So this is all kind of the post work that, you know, again, we were doing all of this stuff manually, and this came up with a standardized way, you know, that works, I'd say, gets you like 90% there. When you're onboarding a new data app, so that there's still some manual tweaking that you might have to do as the operator or the admin of this data app, but it gives you a real kind of solid starting point, so that when you go into the tools like Data Factory and Databricks, you actually can start doing work on day one without having to wait for people to, you know, set up access and configure things for you. We don't have a ton of time, so let me just flip over into, you know, showing you kind of the net result here. So yeah, these are the groups that I was talking about. They all get created as part of that script. If we go over into the clusters, these clusters here, the New York City ones, they're pre-configured and spun up. All of this is controlled through templates, so this can be modified pretty easily. There's two different types of clusters, right? There's single user clusters, and then let me just show you this one. This is called like a job cluster, or I guess a more just general use cluster. And one of the things about, let me just edit, it's easier to see. One of the things that you need to configure, which is kind of the difficult part of getting all of these clusters up and running, is, well, how does this cluster authenticate and access, you know, the data lake securely? So before, someone had to go in and hand code a lot of this stuff, but, you know, using that service principal that we set up in the post deployment, we create a secret for that service principal, store it in the key vault. This is how we can reference secrets. So basically this little piece of configuration says, hey, go to this secret scope, which is backed by the key vault that we set up, and go pull, you know, this secret name. And that is the actual secret that's used so that this cluster can use that service principal to authenticate itself back into the data lake. Now, when you're running as a user, you don't have to worry about that because the clusters do pass through authentication. But when it's running, you know, without a user, this tells it, well, which service principal is it going to run, and, you know, how does it authenticate itself? So again, a lot of these little things we've learned over time, just deploying out, you know, this stuff over and over, and have got it to a point where it's kind of repeatable, and you know, can use composition to build out, you know, more advanced data applications using it. Yeah, let's just flip over to the data lakes themselves, just so you can kind of see those. And then I'll probably pause there for any questions that people might have, because we're going to get pretty close to time. Oh yeah, let me just do this, storage. So you heard me talk about bronze, and this is silver gold, and this is our workspace storage. So if we look at bronze, you know, when you deploy out the bronze storage data lake through the data landing zone, it actually gives you this dev, prod, and QAT kind of container structure. This is one way of doing it, or you can have an entire data lake, you know, or sorry, an entire data landing zone that's just for dev, and one for QA, and one for prod. And then inside here, if we go in, you'll see that, you know, this is the data applications folder. And if we look at the access control around this, right, you can see that it's set to those groups that, you know, were set up as part of the pre-deployment, and then the post-deployment goes in and sets up this access control. So again, it's all, you know, if you're onboarded and the only group that you have access to is this New York City taxi trip dev group, then when you come into this container and try and browse it, you won't be able to see, you know, these other folders. This is the only thing that you're going to have visibility to. So again, that's kind of nice. You don't have to worry about going in and setting up that folder and worrying about the security around it. And it's pretty fine grained. So then from that point forward, the access control is actually inherited kind of downstream. So yeah, that's probably a lot more in here, but you know, that's kind of it in a nutshell, was just coming up with a repeatable and reusable framework to deploy out, you know, the different zones, make sure they're all connected together, and then scale all of that stuff out using this data application concept. So I'll hand it back to you, Max, or we can go through any questions.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, great.
We got you.
Hi, everybody. Does anybody have any questions? That'll be a good time to ask.
One question, Max here, Son here.
Hey.
Thanks, hi. Thanks, Dave, for the presentation. Great presentation. Quick question: when it comes to Azure Databricks secret, is there any way to automate generating the Azure Databricks key vault scope?
Yes. So I should have shown you that. As part of the post-deployment script, one of the things we do set up, if I can find it somewhere, maybe it's in shared. Yeah, secret scope. So yes, through the Databricks CLI, you can see Databricks secrets, create scope. You can give it a name and you say, hey, it's backed by Key Vault, and you pass in the actual resource ID of that Key Vault and a couple of other parameters. And yeah, this sets up the scope. So it's kind of a two-step process. You first have to create the scope. And then what you have to do is you have to go in and grant the permissions to that scope, if you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
So
It's better than nothing. I think earlier this year it was not implemented, but it's good they have it here. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I will tell you this, there's one gotcha. This command, it cannot be executed if you're logged in as a service principal.
Yeah.
And I have an open ticket with Microsoft to find out why. So if you run this script through Azure DevOps or GitHub and it's authenticated as a service principal, when it comes to creating the scope, this part here fails. It needs to be done by a user logged in account.
Oh, so it's still same story. So it's been in Microsoft backlog for a long time, and so you have to go through the UI to create the secret for.
I didn't have, no, you don't have to go through the UI. Like I ran it, you can see here, I'm just logged in as a user right now, not as a service principal. So I have permission to do it as a user, but a service principal doesn't have permission to do it, which doesn't really make sense to me. I'm just pointing out, see right here, so it checks the secret scope and it creates it. And you have no problem executing this locally. But if you tried to run that same thing through the actual Azure DevOps pipeline, that one line will fail.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the showstopper for the fully CI/CD. Yeah. All right, thank you.
If you want to ping me, I can teach you a workaround, but it's not the greatest. You basically generate a new account, you run it, and then you can delete that account after, but it does work.
Oh, I see. With Azure CLI, so you first create.
With Azure CLI, you create a one-time use user, and then you delete the user when it's done. And it was not me that came up with that. That's what Microsoft said to do as a workaround right now.
All right. So you have
Ouch.
you should have. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Do I have any more questions? All right. Thank you very much, Dave. As always.
Okay. You're
It
welcome.
was great. Thank you, everybody, for
Oh.
attending. I'm sorry, somebody
Oh.
have a question?
No, I was just going to say awesome presentation. It was great.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Dave. Yeah.
No problem.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Next session is in November, I forgot, 16th, 17th. It's going to be GitOps related session. It's on Meetup. Please go ahead and register. And thank you. Have a good evening. And I will see you next month. Thank you,
Bye,
everybody.
guys.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, all.